Perfect. All right. Genesis chapter 22 this morning. So this chapter, just by way of introduction, it comes nearly at the end of the accounts that we have about Abraham. So he's not going to die until a few chapters later. But after this point, we have essentially the death of Sarah, and the account begins to shift towards Isaac. And so this narrative also, because of the themes that are so prevalent in the way that it comes to us, really is something of a climax of the book of Genesis in terms of God revealing what he is about in redeeming people. And so we're trying to keep that large view in mind, that we started with creation and the fall, and God now has been bringing into existence the promised seed, not the promised seed, but the promised seed who would come through Isaac, the small promised seed. And so now God comes to Abraham and is going to reveal some things and test Abraham in this marvelous way. So, and then the other thing I'll say, just interestingly, so Pastor Hall and I were at a conference yesterday at Heritage Reformed Baptist in Canton with some of the pastors from the region, and Pastor Drew Grumbles from New York was giving some lectures on how to do biblical theology and walk through it and just talking about it. And this was on my mind a lot because passages like this, there seems to be so many different applications. You can look at this in terms of moral applications and how we ought to live, and the spiritual consequence of who Christ is, and just the facts on the ground of what is being revealed here. So we're really just not going to only scratch the surface of what can be drawn out in the many sermons that could be preached, but hopefully this is a blessing for everyone as we go through here. So let's read the chapter and then discuss it today. So if I could ask a reader, I know we've got some busy folks, so I can also, we have some ladies here that can read as well. Genesis chapter 22, starting in verse 1, and maybe we'll just split this in about half. Let's go 1 through 8, 9 through 14, and then 15 to the end. So someone 1 through 8? Perfect. You can go ahead and start us. Thank you. And then would someone like to grab 9 through 14 for me? If anyone wants to. Oh, thanks, Mark. and someone take us the home stretch 15 to the end. Go ahead, Rhett.
Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens, and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived in Beersheba.
And you can stop right there, actually. That next part goes better with the next chapter, I think, so we're going to cut it off right there. So, thank you. Now, looking at this chapter, the first thing that we encounter is that God tells us what he's up to, what he's about. We don't always get that in narrative. Sometimes we're along for the ride, but here the author gives us a clear interpretation. What is God doing to Abraham? Testing him. So God tested Abraham in our first blank. And so let's think about that. We should think about what is happening here. Why? What's the point of a test? What does a test do? Think of a test at a school or something like that. Okay. Yeah, it wants to measure something that's there, maybe. Anyone else? Well, in a school, you would want to measure so that you can say whether or not someone has understood the material, right? So it would be to validate or prove that someone has the credentials to pass the class, let's say, right? So a test is there to reveal or to prove what's already there. Test is meant to reveal or prove something. In this case, God wants to reveal or prove Abraham's obedience of faith. So the chapter begins with God's summoning Abraham. Right? What are the two things that God commands? Just look for the two active verbs here. God commands Abraham to what? Take your son and offer him. Right? So God instructs him to take and to offer. Abraham's response when God calls to him, though, is, did you notice that? This will appear actually 3 times in the chapter. God calls to him and says, Abraham says, here I am, right? Now, another place in scriptures where this phrase appears quite often would be Samuel. We probably remember the story from Sunday school. The Lord calls to Samuel and says, here I am. He goes to Eli, right? Well, here Abraham says, here I am to the Lord, and he'll repeat that at the end, and also to his son in the middle. Maybe even just thinking yourself about that phrase then. What does that phrase indicate? If someone says, here I am, he's presenting himself before the Lord how? What's the posture of his heart? A servant. Yeah, he's giving himself, he's looking for orders, right? Here I am. I present myself as a servant to God. So, now, with Abraham presenting himself as a servant and God saying, take your son and offer him, let's notice how God then refers to Isaac. Did you notice God does not merely just call him Isaac, but there's a threefold emphasis here, right? Did you notice how God refers to him? First, and these are all terms of, we could call them terms of endearment or love, right? Take first your son, next your only son, Isaac, the son whom you love, right? So he repeats this through your son, only son, the son whom you love. Did God understand the significance of the trial that he was putting Abraham through? Yes, he did, right? God was not commanding something which he had no understanding of or anything like that. He knew the great severity of what he was calling Abraham to do. And God wanted to emphasize the fact here that I am asking you to do this for not just a son, but the son, your only son. This is the son that I have promised to you, the son that I gave to you, the one whom you love. Now, all through this account, we're going to see little details like this, and I'm not going to directly call them out necessarily and connect them to the sacrifice of Christ. I think all of us here will probably do that in our heads, but I'll be quoting some passages as we go along or having you guys read them. But you should be thinking in that way. This chapter is very, it's a pattern that has escalated and becomes the great fulfillment in Christ. And so we call that the type. The pattern is given here, and the great fulfillment of that type, the antitype, is Christ. And so we're going to see that here today. Okay, so we want to think about this son for just a minute so that we have it in our minds. If I asked, what's the natural significance of Isaac to Abraham, and I mean just the ordinary by human relations, what's the significance of this son? How would you respond? What's that?
Only son and heir.
Yeah, only son, heir, son of his old age even. There's no hope for another, right? So we're talking the bond between father and son, but almost like grandfather and grandchild in some sense, right? A very deep love between these two. But then if I asked, what's the spiritual significance of this son, how would you answer that? Isaac is not just a son. Sorry, go ahead.
Fulfillment of God's promises.
Fulfillment of God's promises. So God has made little or great promises. Great promises, right? And now all these promises have come, as it were, to focus on this one. So I quote Candlish here. All his, that's Abraham's, hope now is centered exclusively in Isaac. Thus the promises which which Abraham had received were all closely and necessarily bound up in the life of Isaac. And it was that only begotten son, in whom his seed was to be called, on whom the promises depended, whom nevertheless, by faith, in these very promises, he was ready at the command of God to offer up. Okay? So we ought to be thinking about this in both of these ways, both the natural love, but also the way in which Isaac to Abraham represents the fulfillment of all that God had said. And how is Abraham going to trust God with that? So just to emphasize that, in 1:7 I wrote, we have a few textual indications that this testing is the climax of Abraham's life and the end to which God had called him in this life. So not only had God focused the promise on Abraham, I'm doing a whittling thing. We have 3 steps that there was always someone who was kind of their part of the promise, and then God, through his providence, took them away and focused the promise on one. So first, if you remember, when Abraham's father died, it was Abraham and whom? Who were together? Do you remember the other adult male who was with Abraham? Lot, yes. So first it was Abraham, not Lot. God has taken Lot, and as it were, out of the picture. And then it's not, I lost my place. It's through Sarah and not through whom? Hagar, right? So he's focused again. It's through Sarah, not Hagar. And then, of course, it's through Isaac, not through Ishmael. So first, we already see that all this is focused here, but that's not the only indication. Just as, and I want you to pick up on this as well. When this all began, earlier in the book, when God first called Abraham, do you remember? He said, come to a place that I will show you, right? And now, how does this account begin? Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. It's doing the same thing. Now go to this mountain of which I will show you. God is repeating almost the same command, but it is heightened and extended. God is asking him to come to this place where he will reveal much about his will. Okay, now we need to stop and ask a question. God has just commanded Abraham to sacrifice his son as a burnt offering. This is not a light thing. This isn't even perhaps what would seem like a very moral thing to us. How would we think about that? It kind of seems shocking to us, doesn't it? That God would command a father to sacrifice his son as a burnt offering for himself. How should believers think about this, even ethically? Okay, well, first thing, if someone were to come to you and make this objection, right? Like this, perhaps someone wants to come and say, well, this is evil of God to command this, right? Well, or he might say, it was wrong. Wouldn't it be wrong of Abraham to do something like this? It would be wrong for me to do something like this, right? Well, the first thing to remember is that in this narrative, or let me ask this in terms of a question. That'd be a better way to teach. Should Abraham have put on his reasoning cap and thought to himself, well, God has asked me to do this, but I'm going to judge this and see whether or not I think this is actually a good thing for me to do? Should Abraham have done that? No. Now, sometimes we do need to do that, right? We judge situations and we judge it based on what God has already said. But here, this is not a matter of Abraham's moral judgment. This is a direct command from God. There's no question about what God is commanding. And if God has commanded it, it is right for Abraham to obey. That's the baseline, right? Which means, so just from an ethical standpoint, this wasn't something that Abraham heard from a prophet and he had to judge, well, is this prophet from the Lord or not? Or he heard it in the wind, or had the thought come to himself, maybe I should offer up my son as a sacrifice. It doesn't originate from anywhere except for the direct command of God. Okay, second thing we should probably note then also is, we know the end of the story. Did God intend for Isaac's blood to be spilled? No. Abraham doesn't know that, but God knows what he's about. God is testing him, and God never intended for Isaac's blood to be shed. He only intended to test Abraham that he might reveal Christ to the eyes of his faith. All right, 3 true or false questions. You ready? True or false? God still tests believers, even today, to try their faith and purify them as though through fire. Does God test believers, even in very difficult trying, sometimes even unto death? Does God still test believers to purify them? True. Yeah, God does test believers. Okay? We must go through many trials and tribulations, the genuineness of our faith being most precious. Okay? True or false? God still requires singular allegiance to himself so that even the natural relations of parent and child, husband and wife, are less than a believer's relation to Christ and are to be counted as worthless compared to the value of knowing Christ. True. That's also true. Okay. True or false? We should still appreciate how peculiar this testing of Abraham was. God does not and never will be pleased with human sacrifice and bloodshed. True. God is not pleased by human sacrifice and bloodshed. Of course, save one, and there's some peculiar things about that one. But in this case, what I'm emphasizing is that while there are great examples for believers in this, we also need to note that this is a very peculiar thing that God is revealing here, a very peculiar testing. And I think that's just important to note and to realize in this situation. Okay. Micah 6:7. Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? What's the answer? No, God will not be pleased with any of those things. Can the fruit, can there be any true sacrifice for sin in anyone, even a promised child like Isaac, like this? No. No. God must provide, right? Okay. So in this first section, we've been dealing with God's testing, and I think I'll conclude at 1:12 by saying this way. In everything, how did Abraham obey? Did he drag his feet if I have to? How did Abraham obey? Quickly. In everything, Abraham was quick to obey. He rose early in the morning. He made all the provisions necessary, and he went exactly to the place where God had commanded him. Okay, next, we're going to talk about God's provision. Provision, what God gives, what he provides. When does this next part of the story happen? Verse 9, when they, let's see. Nope, not verse 9, sorry. Sorry, I'm just looking. Verse 4, sorry. On verse 4, so Abraham made all the provisions, he saddles the donkey, they set out. The next part of the story happens on a particular day. What day? Verse 4. The third day. Okay, on the third day. Now, this passage doesn't specifically say third from what, but it's pretty clear, just apparent. This is the third day from when God had condemned Isaac to death. So Abraham receives the news, Isaac is to die as a burnt offering to the Lord. On the third day, the next thing happens. Okay, on the third day, so as the story goes, on the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes, he saw the place from afar, and Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come back to you." In your handout 2.1, the second blank, they and the boy are going to go, worship, and then what? Return. Now that should strike us a little bit, shouldn't it? Abraham already has in mind that God is able to do something, isn't he? What is he thinking? Hebrews tells us the answer here. What is Abraham thinking as he tells these men, "We will return to you, I and the boy"? We're going to go obey God, and we're going to come back. Okay, someone want to read Hebrews 11, 17 through 19? It's in your handout right there. Go for it.
By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. He who received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, "Through Isaac shall your offspring be named." He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back.
So Abraham knew God had promised these things through Isaac. If God is commanding me to sacrifice this one, he is able even to raise this one from the dead. So here it is, the third day, and Abraham is trusting in what? God's power to resurrect. Okay, 1 Corinthians 15, what do we read? Someone want to read that? Christ himself raised on the third day. Even this, interestingly, Matthew 26, 36, then Jesus went with them, this is in Gethsemane, to the place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." I hope you're seeing some connections here as we go along. So, then Abraham and his son go up the mountain, and it's very peculiar. Who's carrying what? Do you remember? So not all of us were here when we read, so I'll repeat, or I'll ask those who were here. We have a few things. There was the wood. The wood was laid on whose back? Isaac. Isaac carries the wood for the sacrifice up the mountain. Abraham carries what? Two things. What would you need for a sacrifice? You can think of this. Two things. Fire, knife. Yep. So here is Isaac. He carries the wood, the fuel for the offering, and he is to be the offering, though he doesn't know it. Here's Abraham, the father, going, as it were, with the tools of the executioner, right? I have the knife and the fire, and they ascend up together. And yet still there's conversation between these two. There's love between these two. There's communion, if you will, between these two as they ascend to this place. So the Son and the Father. John 19:17. So they took Jesus, and he went out, bearing his own cross, to the place called the place of a skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. Isaiah 53:10. But the Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief. Romans 8:32. He who did not spare his own son, but delivered him for us all, how will he not with us also freely give us all things? Okay. Now, Isaac's going to ask a question on their way up, right? So, as boys sometimes do, if they're thinking about things, Isaac's figuring as he goes up, and he notices something is missing. What's missing? The sacrifice, right? Now, how does Isaac know? How does he know what's required for a sacrifice? It's not his first time, right? Abraham has instructed him in the things of the Lord. He knows what God is doing. Yep. Sorry, I missed my place. There we go. Young Isaac has been instructed in the worship of God, and he notices, Dad, don't we need a lamb? If we're going to worship God, don't we need a lamb? Abraham's response, I want to read it. Abraham's response. Where's the lamb for the offering? Verse 8, Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. Now this is, you could probably describe this in a couple ways. There's two things that came to my mind. Abraham's response is one, this one's kind of obvious. It's very fatherly, right? There's a weight here that Abraham spares from his son. He conceals the fact that God has commanded him to slay his son. He doesn't give to Isaac what Isaac will not be able to bear at this time. Isaac is going to worship the Lord. There's no need for Abraham to reveal what God has commanded at this time. So like a father, like a father, he responds, here I am, right? He gives himself to Isaac, and his answer shields the boy from the knowledge that he would not have been able to understand or to bear. And he takes the perplexity of the trial, meaning Abraham's perplexity, right? Stop and think about that. How perplexing this would be to Abraham. Abraham's thinking, what is God up to? But he's obeying, and he's following what God has commanded. And so he takes all of that perplexity. I mean, how would you answer your own son if he asks that? How would you answer? And here Abraham just puts it on the Lord. He says, look, Isaac, this is the heart of the matter. God will provide. And he turns that little boy's mind toward the Lord in that. He's instructing him. Oh man, how wise we would be to be fathers like that and sons like that. Okay. Without hesitation then, Abraham, he gets up to the mountain. What is he about doing? What does Abraham do when he gets to the top of the mountain? He's got to build something. What's he got to build? He's got to build an altar. What's an altar made out of? Stones. So this isn't light work. He doesn't have his young men with him. Abraham, he's gathering stones. Isaac, heavy stones. They got to build an altar. They got to lay the wood. And then Abraham has to bind his son, to tie him up. We were just reading. Who else did we read was bound before he was sacrificed? Jesus was. They found him in the garden. They bound him, didn't they? So he bound the boy. He lays him on the altar in obedience to the God who will provide for himself a lamb. Okay, on 2:6, these blanks are both the same word. Abraham is committed to God and thus committed to slaying his beloved son. So Abraham, we should not be reading this in terms of Abraham thinking, oh, I'm not going to go through this. I'm just pretending. No, Abraham is fully committed to obeying God. He takes, without hesitation, he takes the knife into his own hand to slaughter his own son. I can't even imagine this. And one commentator pointed out very, very helpfully here, different names of God are used. All along, God as Ha Elohim, this is the great God above all, has required this of Abraham. But right at this moment, who is it that comes and calls to Abraham before he kills Isaac? Abraham reached out his hand, took the knife to slaughter his son, but the angel of the Lord, you see all caps Lord, called to him from heaven. Okay, the angel of the Lord, the angel of Yahweh, Yahweh the covenant God. Who is the angel of Yahweh? We talked about this earlier. The same angel that had already visited Abraham earlier. What's that? Okay, so this is the angel that when he speaks, the scriptures say the Lord spoke, directly calling him the Lord. It's Jesus. It is Jesus. He is not a man yet. So the Son of God. To be more accurate, it would be the Son of God, not Jesus. Jesus is the Son of God incarnate, the name that Mary gives the little boy. But here, the Son of God speaks as in the form of an angel. And even that is just beautiful. Here, God requires a sacrifice, but it is the angel of the Lord that interposes himself and says, Abraham. Now, this is not to put division in God. This is just the way he reveals himself. He reveals himself in this way. And then we can learn from Abraham. This is the third time that Abraham says this. The angel of the Lord calls to him, and how quick is he to say, here I am, Lord, right? Your servant. Anything, Lord. Here I am. And he says, do not harm the boy. So while Abraham did not delay or hesitate to obey, he nevertheless remained, how was his heart towards God? He was ready, right, or disposed to alter his course at the command of God. He was ready to change whatever God commands at any time. Do not lay your hand on the boy. Okay, then God says, now I know that you fear God. How should we take that? Did God not know something? And then, now God knows something. God was ignorant before. I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe Abraham won't obey me. Now I know. Is that how it is with God? Does God not know things? What do you think, boys? He what? He knows all things? You're right. So we have to interpret the scriptures knowing something about what all the scriptures show us, right? God knows all things. So when it says, now I know that you fear God, it's not meant to indicate God was previously ignorant. That's not what it's trying to say. Rather, it's saying God has what? God has accepted Abraham's obedience, right? You have passed the test, Abraham, right? Now I know. Now it's revealed. Now it's plain. It was a sufficient proof of Abraham's fear of God. He had learned obedience by the grace of God. James 2:21 and 22. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. Now, James is always a fun one to wrestle with as we read this, but we understand that God, or that James is talking about, or he's contrasting two kinds of faith. There's a faith which has no fruit born from it. It is a mere faith in name only. But then there's a faith that produces works. There's a living faith, an active faith, a vital faith. And he's saying, look, wasn't it proven? Wasn't it shown? Wasn't Abraham revealed? Wasn't he justified before God in this by his works? Meaning it was shown that his faith was the faith of justifying significance. So we can exposit James more in depth at some point. But the deliverance of Isaac from the altar and Abraham from the fatherly grief of this trial came in the form of what? What did God provide? A ram. What's a ram? Boys, what's a ram? A sheep with horns. What kind of sheep? A girl sheep? It's a boy sheep, a male lamb, okay? A ram. Now, what's it called? This ram stuck in the thicket, right? This male ram. And Abraham is going to offer that one up instead of his son, right? So one was there, and you put something else in its place. Do you know a word for that? Substitute. One was there, and God provided a substitute in the place. Right? And so a male substitute for sacrifice, caught in the thicket by the horns. Thus the Lord did provide for himself a sacrifice, an offering for sin, didn't he? Now I want you to think of all days in Abraham's life. What day is more significant? Thinking about this in John 8:56. Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He saw it and was glad. Now that might apply to many days in Abraham's life. But of all days, here where a male substitute comes and takes the place of another, where on the Mount of God, the very place, Abraham doesn't know this, the very place that the temple is going to later be built, is one who was to be, the promised child was, Hebrews says, brought back from the dead. For 3 days in Abraham's mind, this is a dead child. But knowing that God is able to bring this one back, Abraham goes to sacrifice and receives him back, figuratively, as Hebrews says, from the dead. So, if of all days, Abraham is thinking, God is going to provide a promised seed and a remedy for sin. God will provide for himself a substitute. So, then we come to the final section. I am out of time. Wow. Get caught up in the narrative. God's reward for Abraham. Let's just go through this very quickly. So, the angel of the Lord comes to Abraham a second time, so after the sacrifice, after the substitutionary sacrifice of a ram, which the Lord provided, we have the final confirmation of God's oath to Abraham. So the oath was first revealed. Trivia, do you remember what chapter? When did this all start? This is just a know your Bible kind of trivia. God called Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. Yes, you're right. Okay, so first revealed in Genesis chapter 12. God now is confirming the oath, perhaps in the most, or in every time we have it repeated, it is repeated with greater detail and greater extent. So not just numerous stars, but also we see here that the sand of the seashore is compared. And then this phrase is added, which we haven't seen before when God makes his promise, and shall possess the gates of his enemies. For sake of time, I'm not going to read this quote. You can read it, but to possess the gates of your enemies, the gates is a place of prominence, a place where judgment would happen. And here, to possess the gates of your enemies is to really to conquer them and to rule the land. So all this is confirmed to Abraham for the greater assurance of what God had already promised. Notice that. God doesn't really promise anything new here to Abraham. There's nothing in addition to what he's already promised. What he has already promised, he confirms. However, the basis for this confirmation of the oath is, and here's the phrasing, it's repeated twice in here, and later on in Genesis. It says, because you have done this, and have not withheld your son, your only son. And it says, because you have obeyed my voice. So there's this language of causal. Because you did this, now I am confirming to you this. How should we understand that? And I'm trying to finish up and land on this one question, but how should we understand the causal language there? Is God, or how should I say, did Abraham merit by the pure value of what he did the favor of God? No, I think we would have to say no based on how we understand all of the scriptures. Okay? But the language of reward is throughout the Bible, and whenever we read it, it is always of God's gracious rewarding. God is pleased to reward his people. It's not a reward as if that demands of God or that God is constrained, but it's a reward that God is free to give and gives out of his abundant grace. As we know, there is no boasting in the reward from God, because God not only provides the reward, but the salvation, the faith, the good works which he prepared beforehand that we should walk in them, and then the reward. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount talks much about great is their reward in heaven. Or the opposite, they have their reward on earth. So there's a quote there you can read, and then I'll just mention this at the very end since I'm out of time. The causal language, this is 115, the causal language, the relationship there, because also draws us to consider the righteous servant of the Lord. So this is a pattern we're going to see in terms of typology, the pattern that is finally fulfilled in Christ. A righteous servant who, upon the basis of his righteousness, will merit the favor of the Lord. Now, that's only perfectly true in Christ. But we saw a little bit of this in Noah as a righteous man through whom God saved the world. And now Abraham, because of his righteousness, it's put forward as the basis for the rest of his offspring. So you could look at Genesis 26. God goes to Isaac and says, because Abraham obeyed, I now make the covenant with you. And so God kind of uses or puts forward the righteousness of Abraham as a small picture of the righteousness of what Christ is going to bring. Now, we want to keep that, we don't want to be confused here and say that Abraham is meriting anything for himself, but we do want to just be able to read the Bible well and see that God is revealing things as we go. So, the way it's phrased, I kind of tried to phrase it here. Just as Abraham's obedience and sacrifice is described as the basis for God's blessing, so also Christ is the true servant whose sacrifice is the meritorious basis for all blessing, for all who believe, who share in the faith of Abraham. So these are pictures that draw us to greater things, and I'll close there. Lord, thank you for Genesis chapter 22, and thank you for drawing our hearts out to worship you in it. Help us now as we look to the main service and the preaching and the singing. Teach our hearts to delight in you more, I pray. In your name, amen.